Hello, viewers. Welcome to another episode of the second season. It's a learning curve. If you have followed my previous episodes, you saw that we talked to a couple of entrepreneurs who were uh, self made entrepreneurs and they had started their own businesses. They gave us wonderful ideas as to what it takes to start a business. But it is equally important to make the big business a success. Many startups begin with an idea for a product that they think people want. Then they spend months, sometimes years, perfecting that product without ever showing the product, even in a very rudimentary form, to the prospective customers. When they fail to reach broad uptake from customers, it is often because they never spoke to the prospective customers and determined whether or not the product was interesting. When customers ultimately communicate through their indifference that they don't care about the idea, the startup fails. So, a principled approach to a new product development is of utmost importance. To avoid disastrous fails of a business, one must seriously consider factors like lean startup methodology, company valuation, and the skills of acquiring customers. So, to educate us on this further, we have with us today Mr. John Currie, who is a corporate executive turned entrepreneur, and he has an immense experience in launching and building technology ventures in materials, devices, IT, and now chemical. So, can I request Mr. John Currie to please go ahead and introduce yourself. And before going to that, I would really thank you for being with us today and taking time to educate us on these important topics. So, viewers, to let you all know, John Currie is also going to be with us for the next two segments, in which he will also educate us on valuation of the company and acquiring customers. So, John, could you please go ahead and tell us something about yourself? We are very keen to know.
Sure, Trupti. I do appreciate the invitation, and I'm glad to be here. So, lean startup methodology is the topic, but let me just talk about my background and give you an introduction.
Right.
I'll go way back to I grew up in the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area, which has a lot of good schools. So I did an electrical engineering degree at Drexel University quite a long time ago. And that got me into the corporate world. I started the corporate world in computers with Hewlett Packard, computers and instrumentation. And I learned a lot in the corporate world, and Hewlett Packard is one of the top companies before they did a breakup. And they also paid for my MBA, which I received at Villanova University at night. So I did that at night. So in the corporate world, I sold, they hired me to sell instruments and computers to scientists. So I ran around some top chemical companies in their R&D departments, learning all about what researchers did and the tools they needed. And so that was a great background in using my engineering, learning how to sell. What I learned is product knowledge, how to deal with people, sales skills. And then after 8 years, I went with a competitor called Digital Equipment. Hewlett Packard was very good in smaller instruments and process control. Digital was very good in the mid-size computer range. So I went with Digital Equipment and learned a lot about account management, continued more about sales and account management. And during that time, this was in the 80s and 90s, and the computer business was dramatically changing. It was dramatically being commoditized. And a lot of the work was changing dramatically, and there was a great opportunity to go into R&D, a research lab, and I took this position at SRI International. The Sarnoff Labs in Princeton had 1,000 PhDs, and the company was Smart Brains for Hire, outsourced R&D, and it was unbelievable work. I really learned a lot around product development, intellectual property management and portfolio management, uh, venture creation, and technology commercialization. That's what we had to do. We figure out how to take all this intellectual property and technology and make money with it. So that was fascinating, and that culminated in after doing in the late 90s, the second venture capital was starting to take off, and venture capitalists would come to us and say, don't sell those ideas to the Sony and the Far East, bring them to us and maybe we'll fund them. And so we started doing that, and things started going venture crazy at that time. And I worked with a lot of entrepreneurs who took out technologies, and I thought, I could do this. It's not that hard. And so I left to start a company to replace film in movie theaters, the digitization
Wow.
of movie theaters. And that was a 2-year journey that was really hard. It was 2 years ahead of its time. I made all the mistakes. And then in 2005 or so, I started consulting. I just was on my own and worked with maybe 5 to 10 startups a year to get them launched, to get them off the ground. So that's really where I learned the hard way, the roller coaster of startups, figuring out which ones are worthwhile. And during that time, I've gone through a number of um, uh, learning curve. Working with that many people and that many startups, you start to realize hopefully you start to learn what makes sense. And lean startup methodology was just starting to take hold. That was a new concept. And so we can talk more about that later. But I built what really cemented me learning lean was my relationship with the University of Delaware, their entrepreneurship professor. A lot of the entrepreneurship schools at that time were in the business colleges. Now they're all out on their own as their own school. But back then they were part of the business schools. And Professor Dan Freeman asked me to help teach his capstone class, which he launched in 2012, called Lean Startup Methodology.
Mhm.
And I really had to learn it if I had to teach it. I had done a lot in startups, but I had not really studied lean. And that forced me to learn it. And so and then later in the 2015 time frame, I really realized I'd like to be an operator. And so I shifted my model of consulting with a lot of startups to really focusing in on which one is going to make it and get focused. And Francesca, as you know, was someone I was working with, and there were one or two others that were promising. And the rest is history. I've been with Throughport now for 2 full years, and it's going great. So that's a long way to say what and I don't want to say how old I am, but my career has been.
Fantastic. That's really a long journey, but it's definitely an immensely incredible experience. And we wouldn't have thought anybody better than you who could give us guidance on these techniques to make a business successful. So, what is a lean startup methodology, and why is it important for any entrepreneur to have knowledge about this? What are any kind of principles involved in the lean startup methodology? Could you please
Sure.
put some light on it? And please feel free to share any graphics or charts which will help the audience much better way.
Sure, I can go into the basics. I think probably to start off, though, I want to talk about why lean startups even came about, because entrepreneurship's been around for a long time.
Right.
But back then, in the 80s and 90s, the way new ventures were formed were, all formed by very smart people. But what the process was, an idea would pop up, and then the team would go into an ivory tower and write a business plan.
Yeah.
And it was thought the quality of the venture was directly correlated to the quality of that business plan, a 50-page document or a 100-page document that had all of the ducks lined up. And that's not really true. That's what Steve Blank and the people who founded the lean startup methodology found is, why are there so many failures? There just were so many failures. Why was that? And it's because when you do this business planning process, you make way too many assumptions, and these assumptions are incorrect. Undoubtedly, you have to make way too many, and you don't know how many are incorrect. That's at the fundamental root. So Steve Blank, who was an entrepreneur, these entrepreneurs formed the movement mostly out of Silicon Valley roots, who had been serial entrepreneurs and had made a lot of money through their mistakes. I mean, that's how they would gone through the mistakes of founding companies. Learned that it's more about getting out of the building. I'll go through a quick video of what it is, but the why is the process was severely handicapped. And so he did a study of, I think, 2,000 entrepreneurs, and to put together a model of why were the ones that were successful, why were they successful, and the many that were not successful, predominantly, why were they not successful?
Right.
And that's what started to form his thinking and his thoughts. So let me show this quick video, if I can share my screen here. Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so let me start this video. This is on Steve Blank's site. Customer discovery is another word for lean startup methodology. It's probably the most important process of lean startups. It's getting out of the building to figure out what, and we'll talk about what is it that you are trying to figure out. Now, I'm going to break into this because it's
Absolutely.
extremely quick. He really races through this, and this is this entire book on one chart.
Wow.
This is Steve
Wow.
Blank's book, and this is the book that we typically will teach. It's the one when you go through lean startup methodology. He teaches at Stanford, Berkeley, and Columbia. And it is a difficult read. This is like a textbook. So I'll try to hit the important points here. This picture on top, that is the process. And the first part, this is the first part of any new business, is searching. You are searching. You're doing nothing but searching, and searching is done through interviewing, not sitting up in an ivory tower writing business plans. It's searching and figuring out how to do the proper interviews for what, and we'll talk about what that is. And then once you find product market fit, you then go and execute much more like a normal company. And most startups rarely get to this point. That's what we'll be talking a lot about. So this first phase, he says, is the planning. You don't write a business plan. You work with one sheet of paper called the business model canvas, and then you go out and test your theories. So let's pick it up.
John, before you start, could you please just make it into a full screen?
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's at the bottom.
Sorry about that. Let's see.
That's fine. It's at the bottom right corner.
Bottom right.
On the video.
Oh, there it is. Got it. I'll tell you what.
Much better. So you said this entire chart is all about the content in the books. This is really, really creative.
And he races through it. Yep. So I want to stop here because this is where this looks and sounds so simple, but it's very complicated because each of these phases, if you can see my cursor,
Yes, yes.
each of these phases are extremely iterative, cyclical in and of themselves.
Uh-huh.
For example, this planning phase one, many entrepreneurs say, well, how many markets do we go after? And it's very counterintuitive because it doesn't help you to be additive. It hurts. It's better to be focused on one, go
Right.
through this process with one market and see if you can get through it. And what happens is rarely you can, and you have to kind of go back. That market didn't work. We have to pivot to a different customer problem. So that's phase two is all about, do you have the right problem? And in many, like all of the research years I worked in research, I learned the hard way. We took technology and threw it out at people instead of what's the problem to be solved first. This is about a hypothesis around a problem. What problem are we solving? And then finding the technology, which is very counterintuitive to, I like to work with scientists. Well, they're the world class at certain technologies. So naturally, that's how they start with, I work with this technology. This is phase two is about problems, getting the problems right. Very counterintuitive. Then once you have a problem to attack and you have, I can solve that. Phase three is now we start building.
Right.
And that starts with another set of interviewing to building, what can you build, and
Yeah.
getting money thrown at you. And this is a very, very, very important concept. And this is kind of my biggest takeaway, that money must be thrown at you. And we'll talk more about why.
Perfect. So this video pretty much gives a realistic pathway on what you have and how you approach the market. So you do it the right way by not first having the technology, but just finding what people want and then pivoting your technology accordingly.
Right, exactly. So you really, in phase three, well, let's just finish up. I think whoops, darn, let's go, let's go back. So let's stop it here. Yep. And so these phases, each of these, some very specific things have to happen. For example, well, let's take our case, for example. Like We are working on problems in catalysis. And we know there are many ways to talk about problems. Uh, but getting the right problem and really understanding that is the challenge that we've got to solve. And then once we really understand the problem, we're much better armed to know what to go build. And
Right.
what's really important is in what to go build, good interviewing techniques. I We control what solution, what the feature set of the solutions are, and testing every little feature, nook and cranny, and talking with customers. How much value does that add? How about this? What if we take that out? What if we do this? And trying to come up with the minimal product that money will be thrown at you. That is the whole key, because if customers won't pay you money, something is not right. And
Right.
that's kind of another big takeaway of this is it's really important to raise customers before you raise money.
Correct.
That is the
That's indeed
validator.
an important prospect. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you want me to share back, or do you want me to leave
Yeah.
this up?
Would you like to stop sharing the screen before we go ahead to the next question?
That's what it is. Okay.
And
Yeah.
that's a lot of clarity when you talked about so many phases involved and taking the right approach for taking your product to the market. So that was a wonderful short video and a very important explanation describing all the phases.
Yeah.
Uh,
I
and
hope that described, what it is. The reason I was so happy to learn it, I'm by nature, I've learned business development, I've
right,
sales and marketing.
right,
So when I learned it, it essentially is nothing more than good, solid, sound business development methodologies.
correct,
Only start with a problem,
correct.
figure out the problem you're solving and validate that it's big enough and
Yes,
validate that enough people out there have that problem. Because when you talk to enough people, they have a little different problem.
yes,
And that is the figuring out, oh, okay, so you start to segment the market into, okay, well, these problems are over here and this is a little bit different, but this person is in a lot of pain. Let me go see if I can find more people in that segment for repeatability. So
right,
you're really searching for the first set of interviews is about problems. That builds your base of who you go back to start building solutions.
yes,
And then you start iteratively building a solution and checking, okay, here's what I can do, literally selling a brochure.
yes.
Here's what I can deliver to you. What's this worth? How much will you pay me? I can give this to you at this date. And you
Hmm.
start literally working that
Right,
way to find out the minimal viable product, what's called the MVP.
correct.
And when and again, everything is for repeatability. So
Yeah,
there's a lot of judgment and we get into this debate a lot with everyone. A lot of the students would ask, well, what's the right number of interviews? Steve Blank says 100. Well, it really is all over the map. If you're doing a consumer oriented, it may be hundreds or thousands, because you have to
yeah,
know your conversion. How many consumers will actually buy, and who those people are. If you're in business, it's a lot different. It's a lot smaller, but usually much more higher value.
right,
And so how many businesses will convert, and how many businesses do you need to talk to, and who are the right people in the business who gets excited by your solution? Figuring all that out for a repeatable process. Now we can go back to that original diagram. You can see those four bubbles in the very top were mega chapters in this book.
mm-hmm.
And so, in all of the work I've done, it's usually the seed idea to finding the the initial market. That's the really, really hard thing to do, because when money's thrown at you, that's the first indicator. Now you have to go back and say, how much money, let's do some simple math. What could I actually deliver with the money that they're offering?
Mm-hmm.
And you start that math equation.
True, true. Yeah.
So,
So in short, you're trying to say that we should try to figure out a right point of interaction between our technology and the problem points the customer is facing, and that's the way to go.
right.
Yeah.
And I call it like trial closing. Every solution interview is, I'm going to say, as simple as what I learned in sales training. It's a sales call
Mm-hmm.
to test, am I delivering value to you?
Yeah.
Is this what you want? Because I've listened to what, as our third or fourth meeting, I've listened to what you are looking for. I've tried to build this. Is this it? And how much will you pay for it?
Right. Right.
And they're usually very iterative, because you're saying, well, I could do that for you, but that's going to cost this, and I have to go back and do more homework to
Mm-hmm.
say what that's going to cost. So that's why it's very iterative. You're constantly coming back saying, okay, we need another meeting. I want to give you the new proposal.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what I could build for you.
Yeah.
And that's why it's very iterative with each of these initial customers that you're lucky to have found and work with.
Okay. Yeah. That's really elaborative and makes it very clear for every startup entrepreneur to go through all this process really diligently. So, do you have any examples of big fails in startups who have not followed this, or examples of massive successful businesses?
Sure. So let's see. So let's start with a couple. So a lot of the epic failures that people talk about, and I think this is one of the reasons why lean was adopted so quickly by the Silicon Valley investor crew. There was a group called in 19, when the internet bubble, the first internet bubble in 1999, basically popped and went down. It was because of this problem of business planning, a lot of smart people, all these assumptions, and the assumptions were incorrect. So an epic failure that came out of that, with all these smart people from Accenture, big at the top
Uh-huh.
consulting group. It was called Webvan Group. And it's a good idea. It was the first home grocery delivery service.
Wow.
Good idea. Very first one. Go over the internet and order groceries and have trucks deliver them to your home. Nothing out of the ordinary. Sounds good. Well, all the business plans, and a lot of these epic failures, I'll say, is possibly as much from not a bad idea, but to actually execute a winning business, you have to iterate the solution with at a small scale to prove that everything's going to work as your assumptions are. And that's what happened with all the internet failures, like Webvan Group, Pets.com, Cosmo.com. There were a lot of, and it was because people said, well, this is a great idea. Just give me hundreds of millions of dollars. And they took hundreds of millions of dollars and built stuff based on wrong assumptions. And then they realized, whoops, that was an incorrect. Either the cost of acquiring the customers was way too expensive, or the cost of trucking groceries was way too expensive. They had not thought through enough of the details. And that's why, particularly for internet, where is the starting point? How do you get your minimum viable product
Mm-hmm.
launched in your first market
Yeah.
successfully
Yeah.
to prove, not to investors, to yourself, this is a killer. This is really going to win. So there were a lot of, and then I Googled, boy, when you Google epic failures, boy, oh boy, the stories, they just pop right up. You can, so I recommend everyone do that. But you look at the successes, hopefully everyone's seen the Facebook movie with Mark Zuckerberg,
Yeah.
right?
The
So
social
that was
network.
entertainment. So he was, that was a great example of
Absolutely.
he came up with a need, and he said, hey, there is a social entertainment value um, program that
Mm.
I want to do for a college that will be great. And he was also so he was the business leader and he was the technical leader. He had the wherewithal to code and do everything. So he's a rare individual. So that's what he went out and tested. He'd come up with his thoughts and then he would go build it. He'd look at the traffic, very iteratively came up with a winning, a winning equation. And you could tell by traffic, right? The traffic is what went through the roof. And here's another story, the Google story. Google was around as a search engine for
Yes.
years,
Yes.
and they were struggling because they did not have a killer app, right? Search engines, there was Deck had one, Microsoft. There were 5 search engines. Yahoo had one. What do you make money on? So I forget which of the who the person was, Sergey or the other one, who came up, but not until they came up with the AdWords
Right.
concept,
Right. Right.
that the value that advertising is going to change.
Yes.
And the vision for advertising
Yeah.
totally changed. And so they had to figure out, okay, we have a search engine. What does an advertising network and business look like?
Yes.
Right? So they had to go and literally figure out that entire business and
Right.
monetize. Okay, these words are going to be purchased, they're going to be purchased, right? And so it's very, very, and once you go into the AdWords page and start playing with keywords and the prices of every word,
Right.
it's really cool. Then you realize, oh, now I see what they built. But not until it was worth, I'm going to say worth less,
Yes.
not worth very much until they came up with that idea and
Yeah.
started executing on that repeatable idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. So it was this Larry Page and Sergey.
Okay, right. The
Yeah.
two, and I think neither of them were advertising people. So
Yeah. Yeah.
they had to find the advertising team, the advertising gurus to
Right.
to
Right.
to put the model, monetize. They were computer people, they were search people, computer
Yes.
algorithm people. So that's what's needed. And
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. There were a couple of I also Googled companies that didn't raise venture capital,
Oh,
because again, the concept is raise customers before you raise capital.
capital. Yeah.
So I looked at companies, MailChimp and SurveyMonkey are
Oh,
2
yeah.
companies I know of. MailChimp is this big newsletter, free
Yes.
newsletter. And so they put a product out there for the masses, and SurveyMonkey is a survey.
Yes.
They did it all themselves. Another one, Shopify and Wayfair, did not take any money. They did it only with customers.
Yes.
And Car Gurus is another one of those. And another software company called Atlassian. Um, didn't I think they may have raised some, or they were thrown at them, but it was all customer focused.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those are good stories because entrepreneurship is not about venture capital. It's all about getting customers, figuring out a massive pain point, a massive hole, and filling that before anybody else does in a unique way that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so companies, as you mentioned, companies like Shopify, who really did not raise any venture funds, they're really doing good. And today their stocks are they're up there, even if the market is not really certain, and it's going to keep going up for the next 5 years. That itself shows how successful that company is.
Right. And the owners, the argument is, well, the owners and the management team keeps the stock, not the
Absolutely.
investors.
Yes,
That's that's why it's in our best interest to figure out the customer equation.
correct.
And Francesca and I had a funny discussion when we met Glenn. The conversation was, look, I'm going to be really blunt. To me, it's a race between me and Glenn.
Yes.
I need to find the right customer. Glenn's going to find the investors.
Yeah.
So he took a year, but he won because he came up with some money,
Yeah.
and I didn't come up with enough investors. So so we have to keep searching. We're still in that search for the what I would say product market fit is an important term you heard in that video, and that means the repeatability is such that the numbers are very clear. You have sold it enough times. You know what the acquisition costs are going to be. You know what the manufacturing costs are going to be. It's a successful business.
Yeah.
So a lot of the epic fails, I was listing like pets.com and Theranos. You may have heard of Theranos,
Yes.
Juicero, Jawbone made headphones, but a lot of them they took way too much money. Good ideas like Theranos said, we're gonna do blood testing with 1 drop of blood.
It's
Ooh,
big
that's pretty
fail.
compelling. Well, it defied the laws of physics, and
Yeah.
and so the hype train and just way, so operationally there are some issues with a lot of these,
Yeah.
which goes into building the solution.
Yeah.
So right
Sometimes it
paint.
also sometimes it also gives wrong examples to entrepreneurs, that companies like Theranos, who make such claims that they are going to do all the set of testing by 1 drop of blood. I mean, were there not a single scientist who was investing, trying to know does that really happen? So it was very easy for Elizabeth to fool these investors and just get money. But yeah, this is all that's not the right thing to do, because you are going to face the consequences at the end. So yeah, those are epic
Right.
fails.
Yeah, and that's where I
That
look
was
at
in
a
the
lot
news.
of these were maybe not. Um, like a lot of this it's about probabilities,
Yeah,
right? There's always going to be um, somebody who's a Steve Jobs, or
sure.
because apparently Steve Jobs liked to make the claim, I don't do customer interviews and I don't
Mhm.
care what customers think. I have the vision. So he
Yeah,
was famous for saying that. And then I've read other articles that say they disagree. He was famous for actually running products by his favorite customers. He would get feedback from many, many, many people.
right,
He would do the things required
right.
that lean insists on. Maybe not through a certain process, but you do have to get feedback at some level to test
Right.
and validate
Yeah.
validate what are the feature set. And
Yeah.
you've heard over engineering is a classic. People put in way too many
Sure.
features because they're in love with the technology, or they're
Yeah.
technologists, or they're making an assumption that the world wants all these features. Well, you
Mm,
have to go out and validate that, and
yeah.
you have to validate it with interviews. So
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of romanticism between the technologist and the technology. So they really go overboard and try to, make that technology really fancy without even validating that the customer really needs all those things. And
right.
it,
I worked with someone who it was classic. It was He was a scientist who was working in gene expression.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a community of mostly academics who
Yeah.
work in this field.
Yeah.
He had a, a laboratory notebook collaboration tool
Okay.
that would pull together
Mm-hmm.
over the internet all of the intellectual property, all of the public documents, a lot of the CDC, NIH,
Yeah.
global medical,
Regulations.
public regulations, and science papers. They're
Yeah.
all very important as for these people to work together and understand what's out there. Um, and so, how do you create, especially in large companies where intellectual property is so valuable, but you still have to collaborate in workspaces?
Yeah.
It was a very intriguing idea of
Mm-hmm.
how, and I brought this entrepreneur into a top internet investor.
Yeah.
And the person said, that's a super idea.
Mm.
And he named 5 examples in other industries. And he said, there's only one thing you aren't doing.
Yeah.
You should have gotten that up. You should have gotten version 1 up 2 months ago.
Mm.
Get something up there and let people start playing. They will tell you what to do.
Yeah.
And he's right. And this person did not want to launch anything that was not perfect.
Mm.
And he didn't have a good definition of perfection. And I realized at that moment, he'll never launch ever. And he never did.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it was kind of, it was one of those, hey, this is a very informative to be with this guru of internet. And then I realized, oh my gosh, like this entrepreneur is doomed. He will never launch. He didn't like what he heard. He's not going to change his mind. He was right. And so that's like you definitely want to figure out how to get a version
Right.
somehow out there in
Yes.
the hands of people so they're playing with it,
Yes. Yeah.
and
That's an important advice, because you definitely have to have your feet on ground and take advice and collect feedback from people to
right,
for the betterment of your product, for the improvement of your product. Yes.
right,
So
because you start asking, particularly with the different people or the different versions,
yes.
you can imagine, what if I do this? What if I did that? What if?
Right.
How much would you pay for that?
Correct.
How much do you think this is worth? Can you give me some examples?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very, very much today, John, for educating us. And these tips are very important for any aspiring entrepreneur. So thank you again for taking time and explaining every bit and piece of it. And I really look forward for the coming 2 segments about company valuation and acquiring customer techniques, which are also important for making any business successful. So with that, I would like to thank the viewers who have been following my channel, and please stay tuned for such educational and informative videos, and subscribe the channel if you haven't subscribed till today. Thank you very, very much. See you
thank
again.
you,
Bye.
Trupti. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, John. Bye.